Hi, my name is Frank Schaefer, and I am a writer of books like my novel Portofino, Work of Humor about growing up fundamentalist, beginning of my journey out when I was 11, and memoirs like Crazy for God on the rise of the religious right that unfortunately our family had a lot to do with. So I look at reality through the eyes of someone who has experienced American politics in one form or another as a very involved citizen for most of my lifetime. I'm pushing 72. So let's say I've kind of been aware and awake for the last 60 years or so, having had a very political father, very involved in the evangelical movement back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And at that time, I was his nepotistic sidekick. And then I fled the evangelical movement. And as a result, I get all sorts of material from authors. Here's a book. By the way, here's a magnifying glass that I got from my dad. He used to keep on his desk for Bible studies. But I'm going to be interviewing the author of this book, A Well-Trained Wife, coming up on my podcast in conversation with Frank Schaefer. And I've got all sorts of other books that come from people from that background or who have escaped or people writing about it and lots of other things too. But it means I'm kind of in the mix of American politics a lot or talk to people who are commenting. And today I want to mention something, and that is not directly related to our politics per se, as in the fact that Donald Trump is trying to run for the presidency again, and that I'm a supporter of Joe Biden. And I think that anybody who votes for Trump is really betraying their country at this point, at a very serious time in history, with the Russians breathing down our necks and the Chinese power growing exponentially globally and so on. Serious times, and we need somebody serious in the White House, and Joe Biden has been that person. But I want to turn to something very personal. You know, the other day I had a young lacrosse coach who's working with my 13-year-old grandson, and he and his girlfriend came up and had lunch with my wife, Jeannie, and I. And one of the things we feel we like to do is the kind of thing that was done for us back in the day when I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18, and we had our first child, Jessica, at those ages, and started our life in a very unideal way. And I'll bet you that if you had talked to anybody back in the day and said, let's take a bet on how their marriage will do, they would have told you, oh, they don't have a chance in hell. Teenage kids, they got pregnant when they were children. Besides the fact that Frank Schaefer, excuse the language, was, groomed to be kind of an asshole by divine right, being this nepotistic sidekick to his father. What chance would a marriage have with an ordinary, decent human being like his wife Jeannie, who had stumbled into this religious commune and become part of it and got stuck there with him for the first 10 years of their marriage and so forth? Why are Jeannie and I still married? I have fled the evangelical background and the big God dollars that underwrote our early years together. Our lives have changed many times. I'm an author of, whatever it is, a dozen or so books, novels, and nonfiction works. I've directed 4 feature movies in Hollywood, crappy movies, by the way, but I was there. So when I watched The Fall Guy the other day, I really could identify with the characters because I've worked with enough stunt people. So I have a kind of a broad life experience, but what have I walked away with from all those years? And why did I invite this young coach and his girlfriend to lunch the other day? Or rather, why did Jeannie and I invite them? Because as we look back over the path we traveled, it's very clear to us that one of the reasons that our marriage worked, so to speak, was that, first of all, we didn't believe in soulmates, like you're going to meet this person and everything will be fine. For one reason or another, we both had a pretty level-headed idea about the fact that relationships need work, and you're not entitled to a happy ending. And so at one point, I went off and got some counseling, and it helped. And Jeannie and I forgave and fought and forgave some more. And we stood by each other. And so what I'm getting to is this. As I look back, however, there were some people through those years who stepped up and really changed our lives by giving us role models to follow. Let me begin by talking about the headmistress of a boarding school I was dumped in when I was 10 in the United Kingdom, in England, an all-boys boarding school. Could have been a disaster. Her name was Mrs. Eunice Park, and I was dyslexic before anybody knew what that word was. So I was basically put in a special class for slow kids who couldn't read. Was I working hard enough? Couldn't spell, whatever. And one day, Mrs. Park stopped me in the hallway. She stepped out of the staff dining room and said, "Schaefer, why haven't you tried out for the Marriage of Figaro?" Because we would do children's versions of operas and operettas, Gilbert and Sullivan, Mozart, whomever. And I said, "Well, because I can't read anything and I can't memorize anything and I can't learn anything." And Mrs. Park said to me, "How do you know you can't learn to sing something if it's set to music?" For the next month and a half, she sat down in the school dining room, which doubled as our little theater, on an old tuneless upright piano, banging out the songs, and taught me the words by singing them with me. Pivotal moment. You know, every time a new book of mine is published or gets a good review, somewhere in my mind, I say, "Thank you, Mrs. Park." In fact, I flew to the United Kingdom about 15 years ago when she was a very old lady, because I realized that I hadn't been able to sit down with her and tell her what she meant to me. I knocked on her door and I said, I've come to thank you. John and Priscilla Sandry, my brother-in-law in Switzerland, who worked in Christian work for all those years, whose love in life is translating biblical texts from the original Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. An evangelical Christian with whom I would disagree about theology today, but when I was a teenage parent in his kitchen, I noticed that he never let my sister do any dishes or housework. He did it. I noticed that her way of taking care of children in the little preschool she ran was to always have a child in her arms and another one on her lap and reading them a story and let them help do real stuff, whether it was peeling carrots or hard boiling eggs or helping her in the garden. I noticed that when Jeannie was pregnant with our first child, that Priscilla sat me down and said, "Hey, sex is really important. Don't let the sexuality in your relationship flag just because of pregnancy. Take care of each other's sexual needs." I noticed that John wasn't like the other workers in L'Abri. He didn't lord it over my sister. He didn't believe that somehow men were entitled to boss women around. This is all pre-1970s feminism and all the rest of it, but what I noticed was that John treated my sister as an equal. And for all the fights Jeannie and I had over the years, and for all my bumptious stupidity and thinking that I was in charge and all the rest of it, his example stuck. So as I look back over 54 years of marriage, I say, thank you, John and Priscilla, for giving me a really good example and for showing Jeannie and I that there was hope out there if you worked on your relationship. And thanks for showing me that Hillary Clinton was right, and it really does take a village. You know, whatever you want to say about evangelical communities, our community did provide the support Jeannie and I needed for 10 years when we lived there as a young couple. And without that, our lives would have fallen apart. So I look back on Mrs. Park and John and Prisca, Priscilla, my sister, her nickname is Prisca, and I look back at the fact that we were in an evangelical community and I walked away from the theology, but can still be really, really grateful for the kindness and compassion that cared for us. It was like living in some socialist state, free childcare, babysitting. My mom and dad would say, "Hey, you need some time alone," and press some money into our hands, and we'd take a train to somewhere, Florence, Italy, wherever, and then maybe have a stupid fight because we were a dumb young couple. At least I was a dumb young husband. But still, when you put it all together, people were rooting for us And so the point I want to make is the reason why we had this young couple to lunch the other day, this young teacher who's also a sports coach, and his lovely girlfriend who's just taken her law exams in Boston. Very smart kids. Was because Jeannie and I like to play it forward or pay it forward, whatever you call it, not in terms of politics and who you vote for, but the ordinary stuff that makes life worth living. Young couples who take the plunge and marry each other before they find out if they're perfect or soulmates or anything else, and just understand you make soulmates by committing to them and changing for them. And when you've been through enough, excuse the language, shit together, and it's still worked out, and you've had the role models to follow, you realize that relationships take work and care, and that it's not all just about falling in love. And the work and the care that other people have put into my life, Mrs. Park, John and Priska Sandry, and others over the years, whether I agree or disagree with their politics or their theology or anything else, is the reason why Jeannie and I love each other so much today, because we were given space to love. We were given an example of forgiveness. We were given an example of relationships taking work, that this thing isn't easy, you work at it. I look back at that path not as a series of my achievements or Jeannie's achievements, even though I look up to her, my goddess, my lover, my wife, my companion, my best friend. I look back on the fact that we have been together 54 years and have 3 grown children who love us and 5 grown grandchildren. Well, the youngest is 10, but they seem pretty grown up now to me, that love us and depend on us, as evidence not of some good thing that we did, but as evidence of the people in our village, different villages, who reached out with one message: you're not alone. A headmistress of a school who had a little dyslexic boy passing her staff room when I was 10, who thought he was really stupid and couldn't read and couldn't spell. And every essay I wrote came back with a big red line through it saying, well, some of the ideas are okay, but it's illegible. And every word on this page is spelt wrong. And I'd sit there staring at those lists of spelling tests and nothing would compute. And then someone reached out and said, have you tried out? Have you tried out for Marriage of Figaro? Guess what? I landed the role of the Count, which is the big role. Hey, it was a dumbed down children's version played to an upright piano. But you know, Mrs. Park never got back that time she invested in me. No one paid her for those extra hours sitting in that big old smelly dining hall. It smelled of boiled carrots and cabbage and all sorts of crap we were eating. But I've never published a book without thanking her in my heart. And when I flew back to thank her, I said, I got to call her by her first name at that time, a good British name. She'd always Mrs. Park to me through the years. When she was 80 years old and I was whatever, 60 something, she said, Frank, I'll call you Frank instead of Schaefer, because we went by our last names. She said, but you call me Eunice. So I did. And I said, Eunice Park, I owe you my life. And so from time to time, I reach out to younger people, quite often, really, and say, well, maybe I can be that person. My name is Frank Schaefer.